Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for your talk that was before mine. It feels like that was a nice introduction to mine. I found myself nodding repeatedly through your talk. It's interesting that we're similar age, and I think at about the time that you were coding a CRM system for your dad, I was doing something similar for my dad. So there you go. Back in the 90s, early 90s. So just quickly to avoid any confusion around my accent, I'm from Cape Town in South Africa, but I live in New Zealand. And just in case anyone feels to ask the question, no, I don't follow rugby or cricket, so can't speak on those things. So a little bit of background, again, not too dissimilar to Chris in some ways. I have an information systems management degree. So part of that is coding and understanding databases and data structures and things like that. And part of that is running information systems. And I've worked briefly as an auditor in some capacities. I've done work as a business analyst. Did a lot of work in the late 90s, early 2000s around intranets for large corporates. So I have this sort of thinking hat on that looks at business, looks at processes, looks at workflows, looks at things from an analytical and an architecture point of view, as well as being a developer. So that's kind of the way at which I look at these things. And back in the day when we were coding HTML sites, this was a big wow thing at that stage. Wow, you could build a website and HTML, and in those days there weren't even style sheets. So the styling happened directly in the HTML elements, and this was like really a big deal. And everything was about you waving. No? Okay, cool. At any point, you are welcome to interrupt me, so that's all good. I can do that. So building websites was this amazing thing. You could build a website. It was really exciting to create this massive, shiny thing. In those days, you could charge huge amounts of money for what you can build for free these days. So it was a really big deal. And then there was this time when suddenly, WordPress and similar came about, and so it was really easy to build websites. Couldn't charge quite as much. And I've seen that cycle change as well. Websites have become more complicated again and require a lot more specialization and skills. So it's kind of gone through a little bit of a wave. And maybe not 9 points, but 2 points that happened for me. One of those was to kind of go through this thing where the website gets built and the client's checked it off and the designers checked it off and they go, okay, you can put it live. Like it just happens like that. I go, no, you don't just put it live. I've got a whole checklist that I have to go through. I'm just not going to flick a switch. There's a whole bunch of things that I have to check. So this thing of actually you don't just put it live. There's something else that happens that's beyond the build, beyond that sign-off. And the other thing I noticed is that while it was all well and exciting for a number of years building these big shiny websites, a lot of my work has moved towards managing websites. I don't build as many anymore. So managing them is keeping them shiny, keeping them relevant, keeping them alive and up. And that's become, in this day and age, quite a thing sometimes. In fact, yesterday morning at 5:30 in the morning, I was awake answering support calls because Cloudflare was down because of Google Clouds. I'm sure some of you are aware of that. I know it hit Kinsta, and that's why I knew about it. Interesting thing about that is Kinsta, who are one of the sponsors, actually had information up on their website informing their clients about this before Cloudflare did, and I think before even Google did. So that's an aspect of managing websites. I did a quick search on Google just for the life cycle of a website, just to get a couple of examples of what's out there. Quite often they're in a line like this, or a sideways line. There's a couple of them that are in a circle. One thing that you'll notice about these life cycles is they tend to be around 7 items. This one here is 5. Also in a circle. Quite often the maintenance aspect is the last one on the chain there. there's no perfect life cycle, so I'm going to throw one out there. It's not necessarily correct. The reason why I've done this one is I wanted to, instead of having 7, is to bring it down and kind of emphasize the relative importance of the launch release cycle as well as the ongoing maintenance, because they have become more important. And back in the day when you just, and Chris referred to this as well, you just put the website up and it's all done, you can go home, party, party, party. Now there's a huge bulk of the work that's happening in the actual ongoing management of websites. So I'm going to talk a little bit about through each of these steps. Now this is a high level view. I'm not going into detail. There are other talks throughout the course of this couple of days that will go into detail of some of these aspects. This is more about giving a broader picture. The one thing I want to say about this is in these other pictures where things sort of happen in a nice line or in a nice circle, what I'm suggesting here is that more and more these things are happening in parallel. So yes, you might start at strategy and planning and then go down to design, launch, release, and then going into ongoing management. But the more that we get into agile type environments, and if any of you are working with lean principles, this becomes an iterative thing. And particularly with lean principles, some of you might have heard of the concept of the minimal viable product. You're not trying to, this is how it was back in the day. It's like, here's the big requirement, and you spend months and months and months producing this amazing website, and then it gets launched. Things have changed quite a lot since then. And the more this iterates around and around and around, it actually gets narrower and narrower to a point at which these are all happening at the same time. And I made a little icon here just to show this launch release. It is a milestone step. So this is kind of classic project management stuff. So let's just start talking a little bit about strategy and planning, and on a very broad level. And again, this is not necessarily the truth or correct. This is just a perspective. You really need to kind of take this and make it work for your project. The other thing I want to say about that is that we've got tiny little websites that are maybe little hobby websites, little personal websites, all the way up through to massive e-commerce websites that are generating lots of money. There's a big range and scale. And so anything that I'm going to talk about always needs to be understood. How is it applicable given the scale at which I'm working at? Some of it's not going to be applicable, and some of it's you're going to need a lot more detail. So you might find strategy and planning for a small website being a really quick thing. The other thing you might find is that it's just one person doing it as opposed to a team. So I'm just trying to give you a perspective of the broad range. So strategy and planning, everything to do with conceptualization, who it's for, what it's doing for them, and why, and that why is really, really important. And then a little bit of how. And we heard in Chris's talk a little bit the architectural decisions that go into it. How am I going to do this so that this is sustainable and maintainable into the future, as opposed to making bad decisions that are going to incur some kind of debt along the way. So the kinds of things this might include, and again, it's a non-exhaustive list, just some ideas, research, prioritization. Again, if you're thinking from a lean perspective, your prioritization is going to be your minimal viable product initially, and then you're going to iterate through that. Metrics for success, again, comes into the lean principles. Metrics for success as well, if you're defining them right up in your planning, how are we going to measure that this is actually doing what we want it to do? How is it meeting the why of what we're doing for our clients? Ends up becoming something that happens in the management of website, because you've defined we need to report on this, and then that becomes part of the ongoing management, is you actually looking at these statistics and these reports, and you're presenting them back and making decisions based on how you want to iterate. Budgets, it's another thing that becomes an ongoing management issue. Critical dates, if this is around a product launch of some sort, or if there's an event taking place, this is just classic project management stuff that you need to know ahead of time. The requirements for ongoing management and support. So instead of just tacking it on at the end, that's something that kind of happens by the by. Okay, we've got this website up and, oh gosh, now we need to look after it. If you're planning for it, you're then able to manage it and you're able to budget for it. If you're not, it becomes a surprise and quite often becomes a costly surprise. Privacy and accessibility is something that's become a lot more prevalent in the last 10 years. Again, something that needs to be managed on an ongoing basis. Scalability. Planning for things like a Black Friday event. How in your architectural planning is your site going to handle that if you're an e-commerce website and you're selling things? And then deployment and CI processes. If it's a small website, maybe you're developing it on local and then pushing it through to a host. If you're a much bigger website where there's a lot more risk involved, I'll speak to that in a moment, you're probably going to have some sort of staging environment, and then there's going to be a whole lot of questions around, if you're working in a staging environment, how does that move across to your live? And if you're trying to iterate that quickly, how do you do that with the minimum impact as quick as possible, involving your testing cycles, which will be spoken about in a later talk, and things like that. So these are all things that can happen in the planning so that it's thought of ahead of having to do it retrospectively. The risk assessment part, and I've included this in a few slides because it really impacts a lot of things. I signed a contract for a website management project yesterday, and when I was speaking to them about what it is that I offer, they were saying, okay, but how do you handle this? How do you handle that? How do you handle the next thing? And quite often my answer was starting with, well, it depends what the risk is. If you don't know what the risk is, it's a bit of a shotgun approach. But when you're assessing what the risk of each aspect is, if this goes wrong, how does it hurt the business of the client or your business if you're the owner? What's the cost implication? If that's high, you're going to be putting a lot more time and attention and budget, that one over there, towards making sure that A, it's not going to happen in the first place, or at least reducing the possibility. But then also, if it does happen, and things do, how are you going to remedy it? Okay, so risk, and these are standard concepts. What is the risk? What's the likelihood that it's going to happen? What's the potential impact? And then what are you going to do about it? It'll come into planning, it comes in later, as I said. Typical kind of roles that you might see in strategy and planning is a project manager, if the project's big enough to warrant one. Obviously, there's going to be some kind of client or stakeholder involvement. You might have someone who's thinking about the big picture strategically or from an architectural point of view. But in reality, when you're planning, you're involving anyone that's going to be involved in the entire process to find out what are they going to do and how long is it going to take and what's the cost going to be and what do they need to support it. So even though those might be the key roles, if you're doing your planning and your strategy correctly, you're still including your developers and your designers and your support people and your maintenance people and whoever's going to be managing this on a long-term basis. A lot of this talk is really about emphasizing the website management part. So I mentioned that now. And again, if you want to ask any questions on any of this stuff, feel free to interrupt. Also, just another apology. There's a lot of information here. Typically, I'm a minimalist person. My slides tend to be minimalist. I submitted 2 talks for this. The other one was called Less is More, and it wasn't accepted. And it seems to have come through. So, design and build. Now, interestingly, when I started doing websites, design and build were very separate things. So I was coming in as a developer. My work tends to be best when I'm working with really, really hot designers. And I've done some amazing, amazing projects with incredible designers. But the design work would happen separately. The client would sign off on the design work, and then I would get the finalized design work and have to deliver on it. And that always kind of irked me a little bit. Like these 2 things need to happen in parallel to some degree. At least I want to be, if I'm developing, I want to be consulted on it. I want to have a little bit of say, and probably I'm going to change my costing on it once I start seeing what the designer is producing. And once I see the cost, then the design's probably going to change again as well. So there's a little bit of a backward and forward happens, but I think it very much is happening at the same time these days. The other thing that's interesting is that these roles of design and build often get conflated. Is that the right word? They get lumped together. So you quite often see clients saying, I want a website designer for my site, thinking that they're going to do everything, but quite often the designer is not the developer. And you do get people that step a little bit across both. In my experience, you get people that are quite design and marketing orientated who are able to build websites in WordPress, which is one of the really wonderful things about WordPress. And then you get developers who kind of can do a little bit of design. I fit into that part. I'm not really a marketing design person, but you learn over the years, and you certainly have some ways in which it becomes a little bit easier. I tend to see them as slightly different. But they might be the same person. And when you're building a website for yourself, for your own private use, as a hobbyist or whatever, you're probably doing the whole lot. And perhaps you've got a little bit of development skill. Another great thing about WordPress is it's pretty easy these days to go, how do I code such and such to change this piece of text here? And you'll find a little snippet for it and incur some code debt along the way. So go back. What does this include? Development, theme block plugin choices. I pause on that one. And again, this goes back to Chris's talk, because if you're making bad choices in terms of what theme block or plugin you choose, that's something that you're going to have as a debt when you're managing a website. And my general strategy around these things is to try and minimize these as much as possible. In particular, I don't use themes at all. I find themes to be a huge, huge debt. Quite often I'll inherit websites where a theme has been purchased and the theme's no longer being developed, it's no longer being supported, there's security holes in it, and the client's gone, oh, but my website's live, I don't want to pay any more to change the theme. So that's a big consideration there. So looking at plugins that are well supported, that have a good user base, that kind of thing, that are paying attention to security. Privacy and accessibility, I've brought it in here again just to emphasize that is part of your design and build as well as your planning. You're designing around security, hopefully. Performance optimization. Security and performance optimization, although they fall under design and build, are things that will continue into the management cycle as well, because you're continually managing your security and you're continually optimizing your websites. Not only just continually optimizing them, but quite often the measurements seem to be changing as to what is an optimal website. There's been a whole recent change in that. And particularly these days, question of what is SEO exactly with the advent of AI? Big question, and I don't know if someone's talking on that on this conference, but it's definitely a big conversation. Internal testing and review, yes, we're doing that, of course. And third-party supplier contracts. And again, this is one that becomes really important in the management side. It's not just that, okay, you've got your hosting, but the bigger your website is, you're going to start to consider a lot more about who you're choosing as a hosting provider, what kind of support they're providing, what security layers they've got. If you're looking at external security systems, if you've got an e-commerce website, and you've got some sort of external fraud analysis system to detect fraud. Spam is another one. So your payment processes. Yeah, there's quite a few different things that start to come into third-party supplier contracts. And whatever's put in place, there has to be managed. Another aspect to that is if you're paying for plugins, there's an ongoing management component there as well. Your key roles, this will be pretty standard. You've got some kind of UX, UI, graphic design, content, however you're doing taxonomies. Setup and configuration. That's another interesting one that I've come across in this division between what is design and build, I actually tend to see it as three different ones, potentially on really big projects, that you've got designers, you've got what I call makers. These are the people who do all the configuration and setup and stuff like that. So they're not strictly developers, but they know how to make stuff work in WordPress. And then developers are where you just get so far that a plugin or WordPress itself just doesn't quite do everything that you need it to do. And then really at the last extreme moment, you get the developer in to code the smallest little bit of code possible, so that it's easier to manage in that maintenance cycle. I worked on a project. It was a big online shopping project for one of the big retailers in South Africa. That was an SAP implementation. And in SAP, you've got functional consultants and you've got your ABAP programmers. They're two separate things. So they had a very clear differentiation of roles and responsibilities there. And certainly in the bigger projects, I think that's worth looking at. Testing and QA, and of course we do our documentation. The bigger a website is and the more people involved, the more important this documentation aspect becomes. From a management point of view, if you don't know what's happening in a website, it's very hard, costly, and timely to manage a website, particularly when something goes wrong. So one of the things that happens is I'll inherit a website to manage it, someone else has built it, I go in, this is one of the reasons why I don't like themes that much, is like, oh my gosh, what theme is this? I have no idea. I've never seen it before. It looks completely different. They haven't stuck to WordPress standards. And it takes me a while to figure out what's happening here, to go through all the plugins that have been installed and work out which ones are actually doing something or which ones are doing something meaningful versus the ones that maybe just do a little bit and can be discarded and replaced with a little bit of code. And just a point here, I've mentioned this before, a lot of my work used to be here, not so much anymore. I'm going to get some more there. And then this launch and release one, and as I said earlier, sometimes way back when, this used to be a kind of almost like a flippant thing of like, oh yeah, we've done all this stuff, now we make it live. Simple walk away, what did I say here? Everything to do with the boom, go live baby, let's rock and roll. So just a question, just for all of you who do put websites live, what is your go live checklist? And if you're considering what your go live checklist is all the way back in that first phase of planning, then there's a high likelihood that you'll be able to bring some of your go live checklist back into your design and build. You want to try and minimize what your go live is as much as possible. But it's quite a critical point. This is when the website goes live. And it's also a place where things can go very horribly wrong. So there's a little list of things that you probably are going to pay attention to when you go live, like SSL certificates. A lot of this is on the basis that you're building the website somewhere other than where the live website will be hosted. So there's things that change. Your environment could be completely different. If you're working in a Docker kind of environment, one of the main use cases of Docker is to be able to have a development environment that exactly mirrors what your live environment is, but not everyone has that available to you. So things do change and you need to be aware of what they are. Certificates, domain URLs might need to be updated, licenses and API integrations. If you've done all this work in your development environment and all of your APIs and licenses are tied into your development environment, some of them might stop working once you go into live. And I do have clients where this happens. Sometimes it doesn't matter, and it depends on where your updates are happening. If you're doing your updates in live, you probably got a problem. If you're doing your updates back where the licenses are valid, maybe it's all right. But what is your go live process there and how are you going to manage that? Product feeds, if you've got an e-commerce website, sitemaps and search engines. So that's a big one. We're going to, have I got it somewhere else here? Robots.txt as well. So the website goes live. When you're developing, if you're developing on a hosting environment, there's a good chance that you've got it switched off as discoverable by search engines. And what you don't want to do is forget to switch it back on again. And that's why a checklist is really, really useful. Check your sitemaps. The amount of sitemaps I see that have content in them, because there's this thing of, oh yeah, the sitemap just works, it's just there. And then you go and look at what's in it, and there's a whole lot of pages that someone was messing around with and they published, but they're not in the menu, so no one knows that they're there. But they're in the sitemaps. And if you haven't taken them out, or content that you don't want discoverable, well, it's going to come up in AI content somewhere now. So those are things to look out for. Search engines, you might be going and telling the search engine, look, this is where my sitemap is, that kind of thing. Email and contact forms. This is another big one. Deep breath. For one, it's possible that your domain in your contact forms, the email address that's set up, might have your temporary domain in it and not your live one. I've seen that happen. You've got to check that these things work. And in fact, testing is a big part of this sort of launch release cycle, is to actually, whatever you tested in your development or your staging environment, ideally you want to have some sort of tests that are going to run in your live environment as well, to make sure that it's still working the way that you thought it was back in your development environment. Just to make sure. And contact forms is one of those. Emails, I suspect there are a lot of websites out there where you fill in the contact form and no one's getting the email because no one knows how to check it. When you're managing a website, what you want in place there is something that says, an alert that tells you the moment an email fails to send, so that you can go in and fix it. And also, email, it's a bugbear. Watch my irritation. Again, back in the day, you had your website hosting and email used to be on the same thing. And you would just assume that your host would send the email as well. And any client that I take on board, I go, listen, you can't have that. A website serves web pages, and an email server sends emails. They're two different servers. You can't have them on the same thing. You don't want your website impacted by anything that's happening with the email side, and vice versa. And that's an area where your third-party suppliers becomes a little bit important, because it's very likely that you're going to employ some sort of third party to send your email, because they're a specialized skill that's going to be looking after that and making sure that it's working, making sure that email is deliverable, particularly if you've got an e-commerce website. But even if you're just using it for marketing, you want to make sure that your website is delivering emails to you and to your clients if they're getting sent. Maintenance and 404 pages, sometimes those can be overlooked. The maintenance one's interesting. I don't know how many people know. You can actually modify the maintenance page in WordPress. So when you're clicking update plugins, and there's a little screen that comes up if anyone tries to access your website, and it says, I can't remember what it says, but something's happening on your website, come back later. You can actually change that and make it look visually appealing, just as an aside. I like to put a little bit of effort into my 404 pages so that they're not too boring. One of the websites that I manage, question. Of course, for going live, absolutely. So absolutely. Yeah. So even they're part of planning, part of your design and build is your backup and recovery processes. So part of this go live, absolutely, is, oh no, it didn't work. What do I do? And this tolerance thing that you're talking about, if I understand correctly, is to go, how badly is it not working? Do I try and fix it quickly and push that change across? Or do I have to completely reverse everything else? And if this is a critical situation, there's probably a high likelihood that you just need to be able to reverse everything. Part of your testing in your design and build is to test that you can actually recover a system from a backup. Again, I did an information systems degree, and some of my early work was analysis and design work in IT environments around backup and recovery. And because I was working in the financial services industry, they had weekly tests to make sure that they could recover from their backups. Because what you don't want is to go, oh yeah, I'm backing up, oh shit, there's a problem. Let's try and get the restore, and the restore doesn't work. Huge problem. So thank you for the question. Can't see my notes. Yeah, so there's little things that get lost. And again, I mentioned documentation here. Documentation is a living thing. Again, it's like a website. Websites are alive. Documentation isn't something that you do once and think it's done. Documentation needs to be updated again and again. And I'm not saying that I'm perfect on this. I know the theory, and I know it's difficult to do as well. Just in that, I started writing an article on website management and maintenance some years ago, and I was trying to come up with a great analogy for it. So I wrote this whole article around the analogy of maintenance of a car. And I never published the article because somehow that analogy didn't work for me. It kind of does if you've got a smaller website. Oh yeah, I've got the car and I need to maintain it every, 15, 20,000 kilometers. Maybe give it a wash occasionally, check the oil, stuff like that. If you've got a mission critical website, an e-commerce website, something that's crucial to the business of yourself or your client, it's probably not the best analogy. What I would suggest there, a better analogy, is a website as a factory. Building the website is building the factory. When you go live, this launch thing, as the factory now goes into operation and it's doing something and it's churning over, and you want to know at all points, is it working, is it doing what it needs to do, and be alerted the moment there's a failure. And we'll get onto the management part in just a moment. Key roles, everything to do with marketing, support functions, ongoing management and maintenance, developer on standby. I mean, this is everyone on high alert. Things are happening here. And considerations, okay, so there's the point if something goes wrong. What's the sign of process? Who's accountable? How do you check? Is everything fine? And then what do you do if it's not? 5 minutes, are you kidding? Didn't realize there's so much to say on this stuff. Okay, ongoing management. I've got a lot of stuff under here, so we're not going to cover it in 5 minutes. But what I did do was try and break it down into something that was just make it a little bit more understandable. Otherwise, there's just too many things. There's so many things that happen managing a website. Like I said, it's keeping it live, healthy, and relevant. So there's the operational side. There's a marketing and sales function, all of your SEO stuff. This is on other slides. And governance, risk, and compliance. And I don't think this one's thought about very often, but because it's been managed on an ongoing basis, this is all your budgeting, your reporting, things like who's got access to the website, and when they leave, is their access being taken off? Another problem that I encounter quite often. So I'm not going to go into detail here because time is running out. Operational, this M&S is your marketing and sales, the GRC is your governance, risk, and compliance. What I've got here is not all, but a whole bunch of things that are probably going to happen on an operational basis. And these little green stars here are ones that are also going to impact these other areas as well. So something like website and performance and optimization, marketing and sales are probably going to have a hand in that from an SEO point of view. Handling a security issue again, something goes wrong. We had Cloudflare and Kinster offline yesterday morning. Someone in marketing is probably going to be drafting something to send out to clients around that sort of thing. And then there's all these governance and risk and compliance issues as well. This is all the stuff, particularly from a legal point of view, obligations to clients, obligations to customers who have accounts on your websites, that kind of thing, reporting structures, things like that. Your operational, this is your frequency, probably ongoing daily basis. Some of it is responsive and ideally proactive. and some of it is going to be periodic. And again, this risk side of it, where you're putting your attention, your time, and your money. Marketing and sales, I'm not going to say too much about that. I think the main thing I wanted to point out here is that your website management component is involved in every single one of these at some level. Your online SEO, on-site SEO, if it's paid ads and stuff, there's probably little your analytics and things like that. Yeah, I think most of that's self-explanatory, and I've run out of time. So, governance, risk, and compliance. Again, your website management is intricately involved with all of these things. Okay. It's the person who knows everything that's going on, or the team of people that knows everything that's going on, who knows if this new thing is going to be introduced, what is the impact going to be, and how are we going to manage that going forward and maintain it. And again, your risk assessment side here, obviously this is risk and compliance. So just to summarize it up, a service of value, plan and budget for your website management so that it's not a surprise and not a costly surprise. Build it into an iterative process that you're considering, how is this maintainable in the future? How do we adapt? How do we grow? How do we extend? Do your risk assessments. Understand some of this is very specialized skills. For smaller websites, yes, you've probably got one person doing everything. There's no ways that I'm an expert in all of this. From an SEO point of view and a marketing point of view, I'm not an expert. So if that's really, really important, there's a high risk component to that for a client, I'm going to suggest that they get an expert involved. Yeah, I can do some of the surface level and I can back the expert up in terms of what the website needs to do, but I'm not an expert in those areas. Roles and responsibilities and your metrics. And to make sure that you are collecting your metrics, you're analyzing them, and then that's going back into your loop so that you know how you're going to respond with the next build, the next development cycle, the next key piece that's going to make a difference to keep your website relevant and alive. Breathe. Thank you. Yeah, it tends to be where all three are involved. I have not actually used Figma at all. I know about it, but it's not been relevant for a lot of the work that I've done. Like I said before, I used to build a lot of websites. I very seldom build websites anymore. A lot of them are in maintenance cycles, and there's a lot of work to be done there, especially the e-commerce ones. But typically, yeah, all three involved. I like to be involved right up front. Just to share, like, these are my requirements from a developer point of view or from a website management point of view, so that the designers know about it and they can design for that as well. But yeah, the quicker I see stuff and I'm able to give feedback on it, the better. So whatever's going to support that. But definitely not design and hand over. That's very old school.